Welcome to another edition of Geopolitics and Empire. It looks a little different, doesn't it? That's because we're coming to you from Morelia, Michoacan. I like to joke, narco territory, from Derek Brose's People's Reset. And I just picked up some random dude in the hallway. I mean, it's a joke, but it's actually not. So the craziest thing is, apparently you listen to Geopolitics and Empire.
I do, for many years, yeah.
And you're some type of like scientist or something. We got to talking. Dr. Rob Williams, of course, is joining us here in Geopolitics and Empire. And you're involved with geoengineering, a topic which I haven't covered much. People go to my archive of Dissident Thinker. That's right before I started Geopolitics and Empire. I interviewed the late Michael J. Murphy, who produced What in the World Are They Spraying? That's probably one of the few times I touched on geoengineering. On TNT Radio, I talked to Jim Lee.
Yeah.
I think it's Climate Viewer.
ClimateViewer.com.
Right. And so it's just fun being at the People's Reset, meeting both the speakers and attendees, and meeting so many attendees that listen to Geopolitics and Empire, and many of them being people of expertise such as yourself. So, tell us a bit about your background.
Yeah, well, first of all, it's so funny that we are staying literally across the hall from one another at the hotel at the People's Reset. And you do have some Geopolitics and Empire listeners and watchers here in Morelia. So I'm Dr. Rob Williams, and I am part of the research team known as Our Geoengineering Age. And that is our website, ourgeoengineeringage.org. And we offer what we call an evidence-based exploration of the Earth's most pressing environmental problem, but the most underreported, which is weather and climate modification, geoengineering. My background, I'm trained as an environmental historian. I publish books on some of our favorite topics, political decentralism, propaganda, media, censorship, news. Just finished a book about breath training, which has turned into a curriculum for a breath training company called Nordic Flow. And currently working on a book about, believe it or not, yaks. Those hairy, humpy, horny Asian cows that you've probably seen in Mongolia when you were there. And also long middle term a book on geoengineering based on the work that we've been doing at OGA, our Geoengineering Age. And I share your love of history and I would say matters spiritual in the Christian tradition. And it's really fun to be on Geopolitics and Empire with you.
So I don't know where to begin. Before we get to geoengineering, I always like to start big and drill on down and focus a lot on geoengineering. But I think first, because we're at the People's Reset, formerly known as the Greater Reset.
Yeah.
And people know my view. Like I consider one of the most important themes being world governments, globalism, which is our final destination, the end game.
Yes.
And all of these other themes like geoengineering, and those are sort of underlying in this hierarchy. And so before getting to geoengineering, because part of what they're doing with geoengineering is to geoengineer their way towards world government also. With the climate stuff, exacerbating that pretext, because the climate change is the pretext for, again, world government.
The climate apocalypse, right, as it were.
And so just what's your sort of view on where we're at, the Great Reset project? I mean, there's many names for this. Great Reset is just the latest iteration, right, of Klaus Schwab, but New World Order, all this sort of stuff.
Yeah. Well, I think humans, since we've been around as a species, humans have always been, let's say, embroiled in this conversation between centralization and decentralization, between control and freedom, between sovereignty and slavery, perhaps. So this current moment, I mean, here we are, it's very end of January, 2025. It's incredibly inspiring to be here at the People's Reset, to be surrounded by humans who I think are awakening to what's going on. Geopolitics and Empire has done a really remarkable job, I think, of holding that conversational space. And I guess to answer your question, I'm cautiously optimistic. the forces of digital centralization, world government, are formidable for sure. And my sense is that everyone who is here in Morelia is aware of, in their own ways, of what we're up against as a species, and the fact that we're all here in conversation and community, I think is inspiring.
And anything then to add? So you're optimistic that it'll be difficult for them to implement a lot of their goals.
I think so. Yeah, I think so. I would say that at the end of the day, their vision for humanity is at best mechanistic, reductionist, impoverishing. I mean, some of humans' greatest qualities: we are curious, we are spontaneous, we are, in a delightful way, unpredictable. And what they're about, what world government is about, is the opposite of those things. Predictability, top-down control, the squashing of creativity and spontaneity in the name of conformity and predictability. And yeah, so maybe it's just what's in the air today in Morelia, with all of these beautiful humans here. But yeah, I think I'm optimistic.
Yeah.
How about you? I know you waver.
Ultimately, I am optimistic for spiritual reasons. Mm-hmm. But in the meantime, before we get to that optimism, we're gonna go through hell. We're gonna land on the beaches of Normandy. We're going to. Yeah. I feel like that's the road, the immediate road ahead, and I'm just preparing mentally, spiritually, to go through that fire. If we go through it, right? It might be our kids, generation.
Yeah, and you're thinking, I think, generationally, which is the way these world government people think. So it's important to acknowledge that. I think at the end of the day, nature, God, team human, or as we say in Spanish, equipo humano, we will win, but it's a dogfight. It's a dogfight.
And I like how you painted the picture of, again, their technocracy is all about pre-crime, the algorithms to be, digital twins to be able to predict everything that we're going to do and not allow, I think I said this in an interview that I gave, the pre-crime that they're developing, like we were talking about Javier Milei in Argentina and the AI, is that they want to preempt anything going viral so they can nip it in the bud, so there is no organic, spontaneous type of stuff. And so, as you say, by humans, by our nature, we're not like that. And like this interview was spontaneous, right?
Well, I was just thinking that. It's like this conversation illustrates perfectly what we're getting at here. And I know you often reference the Tom Cruise film Minority Report, and I remember seeing that film on the big screen and thinking, even as a young guy, I was like, ooh, that's predictive programming of the weirdest kind. And that is the direction they want to move us in. Let me run this by you, because I haven't shared this idea publicly, but I'd be curious to hear what you think about this. So digital programming operates in forms of binary code, ones and zeros, yeses and nos, etc. And what I see happening out there in the culture is this continual attempt to program humans to be binary, in the sense of you're either for us or against us. You're either red or you're blue. You're either a Democrat or Republican. You're either black or white. And so you're either Trump deranged or Trump devotee, to take, the current occupant of the White House. So there's this weird kind of push to getting humans to sort of show up and make choices in binary categories. And that's the way the algorithm works. That's the way binary codes. That's the way digital programming works. And to the extent that humans can resist that binary code-like approach to the world and creativity and life and spirituality, I think if we keep our wits about us, we embrace curiosity, nuance, complexity, we'll have a shot. Does that make sense?
No, that makes perfect sense. That's part of the way I think of it's a number of factors of controlling us. to put us in I've heard people talk about this years back. They need to put us into a category so that the AI and other systems can be able to classify us easily and deal with us that way. And if you're not, the AI is going to be like, what do I do with this Dr. Rob? I don't know where to place him.
Yes.
And so it's like glitch. The alarm goes off.
Yeah,
then they got to call a human operator to.
Yeah.
And so that's one thing. And then the other point is, I think part of putting us in this binary is their way of controlling us, where we're fighting with each other. Yes. And it's like, guys, no, don't play. It's like that movie. What's it called? War Game. The only way to win is not to.
It's not to
play.
Not to play.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. So you're a red person. I'm a blue person. So we're othering each other. We're enemies.
Yeah. And I often think, I like to name drop a lot of the people I've interviewed in the past, whose work I greatly respect, and the interviews that they did with me. But like Edwin Black again, who covered IBM. Was it the book IBM and the Holocaust?
And the Holocaust, yeah.
And how that was the first iteration of this paper computer system to classify, Slavs, Jews, homosexuals, whatever. Put them in that category. So then, okay, we're going to deal with these people now. These there, and this is kind of like that. We're at a later stage now of what was begun back then.
And you turned me on to Black's work, and in the 1930s and 40s, IBM was operating what I guess we would consider now a primitive punch card classification system, which has now become the digital ones and zeros, yeses and nos, the binary code. Yeah, and I think of Black's term, the courtesy of Geopolitics and Empire, the algorithm ghetto, quite often. It's a powerful phrase, I think.
I mean, that's his term. I've been trying to popularize it.
So. You have been.
All right. So geoengineering now, over the years, I've listened to fellow Croatian American Nick Begic out there in Alaska, harp, all that stuff.
Angels don't play this
harp. Of course, we had Michael J. Murphy. We had Dane Wigington, Jim Lee, climate viewer. And so there's a lot of stuff out there when it comes to geoengineering. There's, like in any theme or topic, there's this spectrum where you have this extreme view that it's like everything is geoengineering, and then people who talk about this stuff without enough sources sometimes. And so if you could give us the whole geoengineering 101.
Sure. Yeah. No, it's a really good question. So our Geoengineering Age, our research team is comprised of, number one, a nuclear geochemist from San Diego. His name is J. Marvin Herndon. He's run his own research lab for 4 decades and watched the west coast of California get pummeled by this technology. We have Dr. Marvin Whiteside, who's a public health official, very high profile bird watcher, environmentalist, who's looking at this from a health perspective. Ian Baldwin, founder of Chelsea Green Publishing, who is a historian, environmentalist, and myself, the same. So we've been in collaboration, the 4 of us, with lots of other players in kind of an ancillary way since 2016, 2017. We published dozens of scientific papers. They're all available at the website for free, our geoengineeringage.org, and a series of environmental essays about geoengineering and electromagnetic frequency, the history of EMF and the rise of electricity as a force in human civilization. And we deal in public documents, we deal in historical records, we deal in patents, we don't deal in speculation, we don't deal in theory. And I thought, if it's all right with you, I want to go to my phone for a minute. There was a really fascinating editorial written in The Guardian, which is, the UK's preeminent, kind of mainstream news source. Back in 2012, and it was published by a former executive advisor, aerospace and defense correspondent with Booz Allen Hamilton, which is one of the largest defense contractors in the world. And the title of this Guardian piece is called "At War Over Geoengineering." This was written in 2012, and this is what he had to say. Few in the civil sector fully understand that geoengineering is primarily a military science and has nothing to do with either cooling the planet or lowering carbon emissions. While seemingly fantastical, weather has been weaponized. At least 4 countries, the United States, Russia, China, and Israel, possess the technology and organization to regularly alter weather and geologic events for various military and black operations, which are tied to secondary objectives including demographic, energy, and agricultural resource management. And he finishes by saying, Matt Anderson, indeed, warfare now includes the technological ability to induce, enhance, or direct cyclonic events, earthquakes, drought, and flooding, including the use of polymerized aerosol viral agents and radioactive particulates carried through global weather systems. Various themes in public debate, including global warming, have unfortunately been subsumed into much larger military and commercial objectives that have nothing to do with broad public environmental concerns. Last sentence. These include the gradual warming of polar regions to facilitate naval navigation and resource extraction. And that's Matt Anderson, former executive advisor, aerospace and defense, Booz Allen Hamilton, in a letter to The Guardian, February 2012. February 9th. Yeah, and I think in a very short synopsis, that's about as good a summary of geoengineering from a consummate insider who understands how weather and climate have been weaponized. And this has been going on, as you mentioned, Michael Murphy's films and Dane Widgington and Jim Lee and others. There is a history to weather and climate modification, and it goes back in modern times 100 years to the 1930s and 40s.
So, I mean, that was like a punch to the gut, that quote, and I can't believe I've never heard it until now. And, you know, when I taught at university foreign policy, and when we would touch on Vietnam, I would always bring up how, again, mainstream sources, the cloud seeding during the Vietnam War.
Operation Popeye.
Yeah, and then you've got UN, treaties discussing this stuff. And so what would you, and so it's interesting. Yeah, I think we can all agree this primary military purpose.
Yes.
And I think there must be multiple agendas, as you mentioned. Can we say one, for example, is when we go to global warming, let's say.
Yeah.
I believe climate change is determined by the sun, principally, right? I've interviewed Piers Corbin, Jeremy's brother, the astrophysicist, and I've told this story a few times. Back in the early 2010s, I think it was 2013. So he's got Weather Action, his service, Piers Corbin, the astrophysicist, and I was teaching a course, climate change in international relations or something like that. And I was given that course to teach. And of course, I taught both sides of the
perspective. I was going to say, because I'm guessing they asked you to teach the official version of the climate change.
No, but that was the cool thing about Detecting Monterey. They gave me the topic and I formulated the syllabus myself. I'm left to my own devices.
Nice.
So I was fair, like, okay, we'll look at one day or one session or whatever sessions, look at the official narrative. And now I Skype Lord Christopher Monckton into the classroom. That's still on my old YouTube channel. 2 hours he was talking to us. And so I don't lose my track here. So I purchased one of Corbin's Weather Action reports to test it out, because Corbin says the cycle change is driven by the sun and the moon, solar lunar cycles. And, you hear reports that farmers are buying his Weather Action service. And so I'm thinking, I'm going to buy it, test it out, because, he can predict months in advance the weather. And so he's got his hypothesis. If he accurately predicts it, that proves his hypothesis that it's the sun and the moon, not us. And I kid you not, I almost fell off my chair. I bought his report, it's somewhere in my records, Maybe January or February, let's say 2013.
Wow.
And he said, March 25th, you're going to see historic flooding in Iowa, Midwest, and blah, blah, blah. And okay, so this is January, February. I bought the report, and we're waiting. We're going to see. NBC mainstream paper. To the day, March 25th, this is when my jaw dropped, historic floods and all this stuff. And I'm like, here we go. And so this is getting me to my question. Do you think, for example, they will manipulate the weather to create warming to back up this narrative of global warming?
Absolutely. And that's exactly what Matt Anderson says in that last sentence of the Guardian letter. We're told that the climate is warming and that this is a bad thing. There are 8+ billion humans on the planet. The Arctic is full of energy resources that are inaccessible. But if we're going to keep human civilization humming along, it would be helpful, would it not, to have access to those that treasure trove of natural resources buried under the Arctic. So to warm the planet, melt the Arctic, and access those resources, and the Russians are well positioned to do this. The United States has a lot of catching up to do in terms of ice-breaking ships in the Arctic, etc. That seems like a fairly reasonable, from an economic and let's continue the future of humanity perspective, it seems like a fairly reasonable idea. Now, selling that idea of warming the Arctic to a public that's been conditioned for 50 years to think that you and me are responsible for climate change, as are our cows farting, and that this is a huge catastrophe in the making, that's a huge problem, right? So to answer your question, yes, I think that's a primary goal of geoengineering, of weather and climate modification, certainly not the only one. But if you want to maintain your geopolitical dominance in a world of geopolitics and empire, being able to control those resources is a game changer. Yeah.
And then that would also be related to if they're warming the planet.
When you say they, sorry, just so I know.
Was that?
When they're warming the planet?
So when it's them artificially warming the planet, the other solution, they'll probably say, oh, look, it's warming, and look, now we have access to these Arctic resources, and let's help ourselves. So, well, there's two questions here. One would be, I had on Charles Hugh Smith recently, who looks a lot at some of these topics, and how abundant or infinite are resources. For example, I believe oil is abiotic and it regenerates, but then the question becomes, are we extracting faster than it renews, or are they just scamming us, the elites? And so do we really need those Arctic resources? Just what's your thought on that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, if you go back to the peak oil conversation, let's say, right, and is oil dinosaurs, critters, fossilized remains, fossil fuels, is it abiotic? And beyond the oil alone, there are a lot of other goodies up in the Arctic, rare earth minerals, natural gas that I think, I don't know how much we even know is up in the Arctic. So again, I think from a geopolitical perspective, there is a contest underway, jockeying for position to see who can best access those particular resources, while we're also testing these weather and climate modification technologies. And of course, this began back in the 30s and 40s with cloud seeding for farming and agriculture, and silver iodide in the lower atmosphere locally and regionally, and gradually got scaled up over the decades. And you mentioned Popeye, Vietnam, as probably the most famous example.
I want to get to your thoughts on the capabilities. But just before that, the other part is they're selling us, because you brought up the warming stout narrative. Their solution is the personal carbon allowance.
Yeah.
And I mentioned recently, I found on a Telegram, someone posted a 2012 white paper, Coca-Cola white paper, 2012. Like I posted it on the Telegram, and I think in my weekly write-up in the last one, the link to it. Coca-Cola, I mean, all these big conglomerates.
What is Coca-Cola doing in the climate change?
Right, and it's talking about a carbon allowance that will make it impossible for you to eat meat, for example, ultimately. And so just your thought on, again, how geoengineering can play up to them trying to install this solution of social credit, personal carbon allowance.
Yeah, so you mentioned world government before. We talked about that. So all forms of life are carbon-based. So goes the official story, right? And world government in the digital age is about moving from carbon-based life forms to silicon-based life forms, let's say, right? So you mentioned digital twinning, right? So can we create versions of you and me that are digital, binary codes of ones and zeros, in the internet sphere, right? And can we convince enough humans that they're destroying the planet simply by existing and taking up space and breathing and consuming meat and all the things that we do, energy, to be human and be involved with the rest of living and breathing creation. So I think this is all part of the PSYOP, let's say, the psychological operation of the propaganda, is to convince humans that climate change is happening, it's a catastrophe, it's your fault, and you need to lower your carbon footprint. And we have all kinds of clever and creative ways to help you do that, right? Carbon allowances, carbon trading markets, which seems like the worst of all possible schemes. And by the way, and you know this, and I'm sure your listeners do too, we are also selling the global public on the fourth industrial revolution, the conversion to all things electrical at the expense of oil and natural gas, which must go because they are evil incarnate. Right? I live in Vermont. If I get one more email from Senator Bernie Sanders complaining about, the oil lobby and how we must destroy it. Vermont is Vermont today because of the discovery of oil. Vermonters, little personal or little state history, Vermonters nearly destroyed all of our living forests in Vermont by the 1850s. Potash production, sheep grazing, industrialism. And with the discovery of oil, we've brought our forests back to about 80% of the state. So I tell my environmental students, you'll appreciate this as a fellow professor, the reason Vermont is Vermont today is because of the discovery of oil and oil's unique ability to power human civilization without extracting a toll on our forests here. Of course, it has to come from somewhere else, and that there are trade-offs there. So let's be aware of it.
And then before getting again to the realistic capabilities, I think I've been the only person that I've heard mention this hypothesis that, because now we're moving into AI data centers, which are energy intensive.
Yes.
Right. Water, electricity. I think I read the state of Virginia's a quarter at least of, Virginia's electricity use is going to be solely for Amazon, Microsoft, whatever the data centers article. And I've been thinking, what if, like you're talking about these resources, rare earths in the Arctic and elsewhere. So we've reached this stage now where they're mainstreaming their technocracy. Or it wasn't there before. So now we're hitting what was that critical mass, that moment, that Sputnik moment, and they need. This goes back to my question of how finite or not are resources. And I mean, maybe they are finite, but at this point in time, they need a mass of energy now to power these systems. Yeah. And so the climate change narrative is like, okay, the plebes, you're going to have to you're going to ration your energy use. We're going to give you intermittent solar and wind. We're going to take the oil and gas and whatever else to power. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I hadn't thought of that, but you're absolutely right. Yeah, the Trump administration's very first announcement, one of them was we're going to build these huge data centers, starting it's Abilene, Texas, I believe. Larry Ellis of Oracle, Sam Altman of ChatGPT, right? The OpenAI, the whole crew. And you're right. That's the irony here, right? Is these data centers command so much energy to power, cool, maintain, electrify them. And they want to roll these out across the country as quickly as possible. So yes, maybe the plebes will have to eat bugs while the elite power and build the algorithm ghetto, to quote Edwin Black, right? With these new data centers. Yeah, it's very strange. And again, back to Vermont. I live in a state in Vermont in upper New England on the Canadian border that is cold and dark half the year. And we have, until this last election, we had a Democratic supermajority in our legislature that was pushing mandates to electrify cars, electrify lawnmowers. Electric cars don't work in the cold, right? And we have working class Vermonters who have already, been crushed by the COVID mandates, scratching their heads like, what? How is this possibly a good idea to do this? So, thankfully, we're beginning to see some pushback there. And I would point to California as the poster state for, I think, what you've described. What did you I love the way you said that, it's like the mainstreaming of the technocracy. Like that seems to be what's happening in California.
Yeah.
And why everyone's leaving.
And so going back to capabilities when it comes to geoengineering, you guys at our Geoengineering Age, if you look at HARP, the antennas can come together and focus into the ionosphere and then bounce back in different points on the globe.
Yeah.
I've heard that you can, from what I understand, they can't create an earthquake out of nothing. It's got to be a zone that's already got prior activity. Yeah. They can sort of like stimulate it to go off again, and then can they create? We know they can create rain. You read countries like UAE,
where they openly advertise for your wedding.
Right,
you can make it rain.
So they can snap their fingers and make it rain. Yeah. In Mexico, we've been experiencing droughts. I'm guessing like if they can make it rain, they can create droughts, which then again, the climate change narrative, and then give the government more power to manage all of this. Yeah. And so what are realistic capabilities from the research you guys have done when it comes to?
Yeah. Before we even go there real quick, the way I like to describe the process of geoengineering, very simple. 3 phases: pump, jump, dump. So we pump nanoparticulates into the atmosphere. And then we jump those nanometal particulates with devices like HAARP, the High Altitude Active Auroral Research Project, which was a prototype. And we now have these EMF focusing technologies and systems on ships, all over the world, and there are maps. You can look at them online, and we have some of these at our website. So we pump the atmosphere full of nanometal particulates. We jump them with electromagnetic energy, and we can steer. They are attempting to steer storms, steer clouds, create clouds, destroy clouds, move cyclonic wind activity around, stop it, start it. And again, it sounds nuts, except that it's been going on for 100 years. And there are tens of thousands of pages of public documents available to anybody who wants to look that indicate this is happening. And then, of course, the last and most catastrophic is the dump part. We pump, we jump, and then all of this all these nanoparticulate metals have to go somewhere. And of course, they fall from the sky, and they seep down into rivers and streams and lakes, and they coat the bark of trees, and they kill insects and birds and bees and bats and compromise our respiratory health as humans. And it's a catastrophe. And this, of course, is all blamed on climate change, right? And CO2 buildup in the atmosphere. And we're familiar with the official story. There's a beautiful researcher. She just left us a couple of years ago. I'm guessing your audience is familiar with Rachel Carson, who wrote a book called Silent Spring. It's a woman named Rosalind Peterson in California who spent 3 decades publicizing early geoengineering activity over the state. And she is the Rachel Carson of the anti-geoengineering movement. She was a crop loss adjuster. She worked for the state of California, and she literally spent every day of her working life traveling across the state of California, looking at the sky, looking at farms, looking at the floods that were beginning to be invoked by these technologies, and she began to call it out. Most famously in front of the United Nations in 2007, she was invited to give a talk there about all this. She talked about weather derivatives and how investors could make money betting on crops, knowing weather patterns that will be manipulated. The financial element of geoengineering.
So that's another angle.
That's another angle. Yeah. So pump, jump, and dump is sort of the 3-phase process that's involved in geoengineering. And as far as applications, command and control. This is a Pentagon project. It's a military project. When you ionize the atmosphere, number 3, you can enhance communications. You can throw signals further through an ionized atmosphere than you could otherwise. Communication is super important to sort of geopolitics. Computers, number 4, you can enhance computer capability, connectivity, etc. Right? Again, if you're working through the ionized ether, let's say. Controversial one, but there's a lot of talk about all these things flying around in the sky. Some people call them, well, they go by many names, but let's call it exotic propulsion craft. And there's some speculation about ionizing the atmosphere there. But I think near and dear probably to our hearts is what I would call the climate change narrative. We can create the appearance or the reality of climate change, but disguise it under this official story, right? And then finally, I would say cyborgia. We can use these technologies as a way to control human populations. And this ties in with the injections and other forms of invasive technology, surveillance, the panopticon, the algorithm ghetto, et cetera. Geoengineering creates the conditions to enhance the surveillance through computers, communications, command, control, all of these other technologies. So this is a military operation, as even more so than it's a civilian one.
And that last point, could you just give a further example of how they could create those conditions? Because the one I think I already gave is they create the droughts, and then the mainstream media and governments will react and say, oh, look, we don't have water because of you guys, CO2, and so now we need to impose rationing and eating the bugs. And I'm like, but this is not even a joke. Like, I've seen Mexican beer companies, I've commented on that in my newsletter. They've started introducing 5% cricket powder into the malt. You go to, stuff like this. Yeah. We published a paper in 2018 about the California fires, the wildfires, and geoengineering, and decades of geoengineering, weather and climate modification, creating drought on the west coast of California. All of those nanoparticulate metals coat the tree bark. They choke off the trees from breathing, all other forms of life. They increase the flammability of the forest, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So when you're ready to create the conditions for, let's say, the LA fires, the natural environment has been primed, if you will, with these technologies to go up in flames when the time comes. And relocation and climate migration. So Rog Nationalist I had on the podcast, he's been doxxed now, I forget his real name, but he speaks a lot about climate migration. I remember, I think it was 2016 when they had the COP16, I think it was in Cancun, Mexico.
I think that's right, yeah.
And they had one of their papers which talked about forced relocation. So the powers that be could be like, you know what? We don't want people living in rural parts of Mexico. There's floods, droughts, whatever going on there. We need to push them into the 15-minute. The resilient cities. Where I live, Guadalajara is a resilient city.
Yeah, so then, talk about
I can imagine there's people who are too sovereign in regions of Mexico, so they can maybe there's forests, set them on fire, and those people will be forced to, it'll be too expensive to rebuild. They've lost everything. By hook or by crook, they have to go migrate to the cities.
Yeah, that's beautifully said. And California, again, I think is the poster state for this. Even before COVID, we've seen California emerge as kind of a prototype of this kind of new surveillance society. Where has everyone gone? They've left California. They've gone to Texas. They've gone to Florida. They've gone anywhere but California. And now we're seeing sort of the systematic destruction through the wildfires, through the high taxes, through the COVID mandates of large swaths of California for the purpose of rebuilding and privatizing in this new image, Agenda 30, whatever you want to call it. And I think, again, we're here in Morelia at the Greater Reset, so people, I think, are perhaps a bit more aware than some about what's going on. I know you and I are both, I think, follow Julian Assange's work and, career and debacle.
I've had on his right-hand man, Christian Grafenstein, I can't remember pronounce his last name, the editor of WikiLeaks. In 2020, he was on,
and Assange called all this out early, and just to answer your question about other technologies, Assange flagged smart dust, so-called smart dust, as one of these early surveillance technologies. And smart dust is smart because it's these biosensors are able to be directed in an ionized atmosphere in which we have electromagnetic currents of energy that we're more and more capable of being steered. And for those who follow the fires in California, the Paradise Fire, et cetera, it certainly appeared like there was some military-grade energy weapon technology at use there. And that's probably a bigger conversation than for today. But there's some researchers, Alana Freeland and others, and I've interviewed Alana probably half a dozen times. And she's the matriarch, I would say, of kind of calling a lot of this stuff to people's attention.
I've got some of her books. I haven't had time to read them yet, and I've been meaning to get her on. So hopefully this year,
I'll connect you with her. She just dropped her 4th book on geoengineering, published by a Vermont press, Inner Traditions, called The Geoengineered Transhuman. And I just interviewed her about the book, and it is, what's great about Alana is when you get one of her books, there's the book, the narrative, and then there are the footnotes. And it's like getting 2 books in one. For those of us who wonk out on the research and the scholarship, she's really par excellence. She's great.
Is that a podcast on our Geoengineering Age?
Well, yes, but YouTube took it off within hours of us putting it up.
But I guess you've
RGA,
got
but
Rumble.
we're on Rumble and Spotify, so you can listen to it.
And Substack
And it's also on Substack.
doesn't deplatform that stuff yet.
Not yet.
We'll see.
That's a whole other conversation. Yeah.
Substack, whose only payment processor is Stripe, on Mark Carney, who sits on the board. I think the external board of Stripe. So not a good.
I know. Yeah, and it's so funny. Like all the great journalists have migrated and are, speaking of migration, migrating to Substack. And yeah, I think you and I both worry. It's like, well, it's yet another platform, and it's bomb-proof.
That's been my whole podcast life, migrating. I just my ex. I used to have an old mailing list, which I just merged into the Substack mailing list, and I just exported my email list from Substack just in case, because you can imagine a future. Well, okay, if something happens to Substack, I got my list, and we're going to yet another platform.
And by the way, thank you for leading the charge on that. I mean, there's a number of you out there who are, you stay with it. Derek Bros also, right? You're adept, you're nimble, you're agile, and it's like, oh, we're going to figure out ways to stay on the air.
We're going to keep on trucking until we can't truck no more.
But back to censorship. It is interesting. I feel like geoengineering is one of the last untouchable conversations that will get you thrown off if you bring it up in the wrong way. Like Geoengineering Watch is probably the most well-known Dane's platform, and I have some thoughts about that. Jim Lee is out there on the East Coast with Climate Viewer, and his timeline for weather and climate modification, his historical timeline is excellent. For people who have a historical bent, they're like, all right, so give me some dates, give me some pivotal moments. He goes back 150 years and lays it all out. It's great resource. Yeah. But they really don't want us talking about geoengineering, and they really don't want us connecting geoengineering with these catastrophic events that are being blamed on carbon dioxide and climate change and, cow farts and human breathing and meat production and all the things that we're familiar with. They don't want us to have that conversation.
Let's see if we can get kicked off of
Pentagon
Tube, as I like to call it. I'm still on Pentagon Tube. By the way, I went into my Pentagon Tube dashboard the other day, and it says, you can now, we have pronouns on YouTube.
Wow.
Great. Wonderful.
Wow.
So would you say it's like with any other topic that we treat, that's the limited hangout, what you just mentioned, where you can cover geoengineering. For example, Dane, I think he believes in the climate change narrative. As far as I understand it.
I've heard him, I think he does too. And maybe he's doing that to stay on the air. I don't know.
So what when it comes to geoengineering, what aspect of the bringing out would get your head cut off?
I think if you were to say that geoengineering is the environmental elephant in our civilizational living room, and if you really want to understand climate change, you have to look at these military projects involving weather manipulation and climate modification to understand what the heck is going on. When you start down that road and you sort of frame it, which it is, as a military project, the powers that be begin to get a little uncomfortable.
And what about, so we can speculate, but like the fires in California now, Carolina, the hurricane.
Yeah. Lahaina.
Right. Could we pretty much say that those are likely geoengineered events?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of factors. And again, the 2018 paper on the California fires is probably our best single paper on this, because it looks at the history of changing the California climate, the forests, the rivers, the streams, the soil quality, essentially turning the state into a tinderbox through the application of drought, so that when it was time to light LA up or Paradise up or whatever, the conditions were ripe. And that might sound like a stretch until you understand just how long, how many decades these projects, these geoengineering projects, have been in play, and how they have dramatically altered not just the flora, but the fauna too, the creatures, which is sort of the most heartbreaking part of all of this. Like bees, birds, bats, wildlife, like animal and plant populations are crashing, not because of CO2 increase, obviously, because carbon dioxide is the most important gas for life in the plant kingdom. They're crashing because of the destruction wrought by these military technologies. And and the people who are last to this table, my friend, are the environmentalists, which is such a tragedy. I'm an environmentalist on even-numbered days, and it breaks my heart that the mainstream environmental organizations, my buddy Bill McKibben down the road in Vermont, lives an hour from me, I know Bill well, they will not engage with geoengineering. It's truly a catastrophe.
I think for me, one of the best ways to visualize what you just said, I was at the beach a couple months back and turned on the TV. And the Superman, I don't have a TV in my house, so, and so I turned on the TV, after you come back from the beach, chilling out, and Superman movie was on. Man of Steel.
Yeah.
I don't believe I'd seen it previously. Yeah. And it was entertaining and well made. And they, that alien race from Krypton or whatever, they had the what do they call it? The world machine or something? It's like deploy their world maker or something.
Yeah.
And it was terraforming the planet.
Yeah.
And that's kind of like basically what they are doing. And I think it was, it was a great visualization of what's happening. What other, when it comes to geoengineering, for you guys at our geoengineering age, what else is important here to discuss?
Yeah, I think solutions are really important. And this will sound weird, but people ask when they begin to understand what's going on, what can we do? I said, the first thing you can do is optimize your breathing. Because we humans breathe 20,000 breaths per day. As we learned at the conference here this morning in Morelia, most of us are mouth breathers, and we're ingesting through our mouths all of these nanoparticulates that are floating around. Geoengineering, among other things, is a form of air pollution. It's respiratory. It leads to respiratory disease. So if you can optimize your breathing 20,000 breaths per day, you're going to be a lot sharper and clearer and mentally and physically and spiritually fit, back to the beginning of our conversation, so that we can keep our wits about us. Second thing is stop having a conversation about conspiracy theories as it relates to this topic. There are 100 years of history about weather manipulation and climate modification. It was an open conversation in the United States until the late 1970s, when the United Nations issued the Environmental Modification Treaty, and all conversation about this topic went underground. So when people pretend like it's a nutter thing to talk about, just remind them gently, lovingly, with compassion, that this is simply historical fact. And we need to get over that. so that we can have a public conversation about what to do. A lot of states are passing or introducing legislation to try and limit geoengineering. You and I both know that the centralized powers that be aren't really interested in having that conversation, and they'll find all kinds of ways around that. However, I think it's a really powerful way to raise people's understanding about geoengineering in the legislative and the public arena. So that's good. And most of all, just as we look out the window here in Morelia, it's a beautiful, golden hour afternoon, late January. And, we live on a most magnificent, beautiful, living, breathing earth, and never to take that for granted. Really, gratitude goes a long way, I think. And at our website, we offer, lots of free resources, and we'd encourage people to read up on geoengineering and share it with their neighbors and friends, and just develop sort of a larger civilizational awareness of what we're up against, and stop blaming yourself and your loved ones for climate change. That's just not all that helpful.
You mentioned respiratory illness. And George Gammon calls it the cerveza sickness.
Oh,
right.
I've never heard that.
The 2020s. The thing that happened in the 2020s, we're trying to skirt the Pentagon tube.
Yes.
AI, pre-crime algorithm ghetto. Even SoundCloud, where I host my audio files, I think it was last year.
They give you a hard time with SoundCloud?
They deleted my first podcast interview, it was a biotech expert. So, they're getting, podcasting is the final bastion.
It is.
Take you down Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube.
Yeah.
They haven't touched websites yet or podcasts, and it's like now they're starting to. You can feel the nails scratching at the door.
Yeah.
But so the respiratory thing, if we can speculate, and I think I love speculating, but I think we just have to out front state, okay, we're going to go into speculative mode versus what we were just discussing now. Like we got the documents, the patents, okay, that's clear. You can speak from a perspective of factual and scientific. And we might have less documentation here, but let's speculate a bit. Could you see any relation to what happened in the 2020s and geoengineering that played some part?
Oh, I think so. Yeah, and so many millions of people called this out around the world when we were mandated to lock down and socially distance and mask up and all those horrible things we're asked to do, and people retreated into their homes. We saw a wave of infrastructural building, right? Towers, new, technologies started appearing across the landscape. And some of those had to do with new and powerful forms of electromagnetic energy networking. I won't mention any numbers, but we're all familiar. Yeah. And that, of course, directly relates back to the pump, jump, and dump phenomenon, right? You need powerful networked electromagnetic energy technologies to direct and steer, let's say, and influence the atmosphere. And so, and then when the activity is occurring and the nanometal particulates are falling, right? Anybody who's at all aware and sensitive to the natural world, when they're moving through it, you kind of feel like a chicken in a microwave on the days when that activity is taking place. And it is deadly, I would say, and certainly compromising to one's health. So simply, again, to be aware, to take precautions, to learn how to breathe properly, which is to say through the nose, to recognize that carbon dioxide is our body's most important respiratory gas. It's not a waste gas killing the planet. Carbon dioxide triggers the body's urge to breathe. Carbon dioxide, as we learned this morning in the keynote from Mark, carbon dioxide lubricates the flow of oxygen and energy into the lungs and into the red blood cells. And finally, carbon dioxide catalyzes every one of our 50 trillion cells in our bodies to breathe better. So make carbon dioxide your friend, not your enemy. and recognize that we are in this beautiful reciprocal dance of gratitude with the rest of creation, God's creation, let's say, on the planet. When we breathe in, we can thank the plants. And when we breathe out, we give the gift back to the plants. And that happens all day, all night, every day. Respiration is reciprocation. And so to recognize our innate life force as humans and consciously and strategically optimize that innate life force. And the spiritual mystics, Christians and elsewhere, figured this all out a long time ago. But just to acknowledge the power we have as individuals standing in our sovereignty to simply participate in that beautiful ebb and flow all day, every day, I think is a bit magical.
So I think this was a good breaking in on geoengineering. You mentioned the transhuman aspect.
Yes.
And I think we can check out, I'll be checking out your interview with Elena. Just real quick, could you give us just a snapshot of what you think? We already discussed some of the ingredients in the stew, the technocracy, the geoengineering, the carbon allowances, the climate change.
Yeah.
What would be beyond, like, some of these would be their further goals, right? Transhumanism. Yeah. I guess they're trying to merge iron and clay, man and machine, or what?
That's beautifully said.
I stole that from the Bible. So.
I was going to say it's very biblical of you. Yeah. Yeah. Well, we're familiar. Your viewers and listeners are familiar with Yuval Noah Harari's work, and one of the few things I agree with Mr. Harari on is his thesis in his first book about humans and what makes us so powerful as a species. He says we humans are the most powerful species on the planet because we are able to collaborate flexibly in large groups around shared stories. And I like that. It's an elegant little definition, I think. Harari also says, more infamously, that we will become nothing more than hackable animals if the world technocrats, transhumanists have their way. And I think that little phrase, hackable animals, is a good one to answer your question, because these geoengineering technologies are not just about manipulating weather and altering the climate. They're about changing the electromagnetic frequency of the planet so that these technologies that you and I are concerned about, and everyone else is concerned about here, can be deployed more readily. So when you ionize the atmosphere, you make more possible command, control, communications, computers, the desire to merge through electromagnetic technologies, humans, with these digital technologies. And I'm channeling your inner impression of Klaus Schwab here when he said famously, whenever that was a few years ago, we will merge the biological and the digital and the technological. Right? That's kind of his famous line from his speeches and his book, The Great Reset. So I think we have to keep our wits about us and hold fast in our curiosity, hold fast in our compassion, hold fast in our courage, and be as unpredictable and spontaneous and as fun as possible.
And you'd probably say one way of being, apart from what you said, being, I think that's a strong point, and other people have said that, being healthy so you can keep your wits about you, that's one of the most important things. But if you were, I think one thing we all should strive towards is having a plan B.
Yes.
Having a second residency that can be in partnership with other trusted people, where you can at least have your own water and food that can power you through. If your home if they burn down your home, or you get locked into if you live in an urban setting, you get debanked. Okay, we're heading out to live with the savages, like in Brave New World.
It's the reservation.
Right.
We're going to go out there with John
on
the reservation. Yeah.
So I think you'd probably agree. And there can be, you want to choose, but you also never know when something's going to happen to location.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, yeah, and absolutely. Yeah, and shout out to the Vermonters who are listening and watching here, because Vermont is a place, it's an incredibly resilient place. I didn't mention this, but I live in a county in Vermont in the center of the state that is the second most flood-prone county in the United States now because of of weather warfare. We have experienced historic floods 3 times now in the past several years, and it's been devastating to the center part of the Green Mountains, our communities there, including the town I live in. And Vermonters get up every morning and they just get on their tractors and in their trucks and they fix what's broken, and they do it with a smile, and they take care of their neighbors, and they don't complain. And at the end of the day, you're right. We need to have, if not a plan B, we need to fortify plan A as best we can. So yeah, fresh food, fresh water, a woodlot, ways to generate your own heat and light beyond the electrical grid, the company of good friends and neighbors and family, singing, dancing, making merry, good craft beer, good local yak beef. All of these are considerations. And I know you talk a lot about that, and that's a really important message, I think.
And it just keeps resurging with the many guests, and I ask for solutions. And, I always cite Teddy Roosevelt, do what you can with what you got where you're at. And it's like, there's nothing more you can do, I think, pretty much.
Yeah.
And this is what's historically been done.
Yeah.
Some of our forefathers who've lived through hell and pain and sort of what you just laid out. You do what you can, the best you can. And
yeah, there's an old adage, you may have heard this in kind of the spiritual community, energy flows where focus goes. So we keep our focus on health, strength, happiness, love, community. They've got big plans for Team Human, Equipo Humano, for sure, and they don't hide those plans. So we must do our best to hold fast as a species and play the long game. And I appreciate Geopolitics and Empire for holding this conversational space so beautifully. And I guess I'd encourage you to keep, I know it can be hard, I encourage you to keep doing what you're doing. And I'm really glad we had this chance to meet and talk, and we got several days ahead of us to have more fun.
All right, that'll do it for this chat. Again, the links are in the description for Dr. Rob's website, so subscribe there, and hopefully we'll be coming to you with more in-person interviews. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.